Can you feel it? We're surrounded by it. Confused by it. Lost in it. Darkness. But can you see it? The light shines in the darkness, but the darkness has not overcome it. For you are my lamp, O Lord. My God lightens my darkness. He came to save us. He came to be the light of the world, so that whoever follows him never has to stay in the dark. He made us the light of the world, a city built on a hill, so that the world would come to know Emmanuel. Can you feel it? God is with us.
Well, can you see it? I tell you, as far as I'm concerned, our ability to see the light of Jesus is absolutely critical to our lives as Jesus followers. I mean, we need to be able to see the light to help us find our way through the darkness that surrounds us day after day after day. The prophet Isaiah knew about this. He said, looking ahead toward the coming Messiah, he said, the people who walked in darkness, they've seen a great light. Those who dwell in a land of deep darkness, on them light has shone. I tell you, whenever I hear those words from Isaiah, I think about the star that the wise men followed. I think about the angels that lit up the sky and scared the shepherds to death on the night Jesus was born. I mean, the truth of the matter is, if you really think about it, light is the defining characteristic of God's work, and it's been so since the very beginning. I mean, you can't get through the first 3 verses of the first book of the Bible until you hear something said about light. Remember how it goes? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters, and here it comes, and God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. Did you notice that light emerged before he even created the sun? He spoke it, and light came. Now, when John talks about this, it took him 4 verses to get to his talking about the light. He said it like this: in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God, and all things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. But what has come into being in him was life, and here it comes, and that life was a light to all people. And then he said this audacious statement. He said, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness didn't overcome it. Please don't miss that. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness didn't overcome it. Do you believe that? Light and darkness. I'll tell you this much. I believe we are much more comfortable with the light than we are with the darkness. At least that's true with the light that we can control. I mean, the darkness, you see, we can't control. But the light, well, our earthly light, that is, we can control it with a switch or with a match or even with a swipe on our cell phones. But the darkness, that's another thing altogether. Now, I'll tell you this. I can flip a switch at night in my house, and the darkness that enveloped the room is gone. Or if I need to go out to my car after the sun sets, I can walk out my front door. I can walk to my car that's parked in the driveway, and all of a sudden, a motion sensor on the light fixture that's above my garage doors triggers the flow of electricity to the lights, and the darkness is suddenly obliterated by twin 100-watt floodlights. But that's not the kind of darkness, and it's not the kind of light that Isaiah and John were talking about. I think you know that. It's not the kind of darkness, it's not the kind of light that David was talking about in 2 Samuel 22, verse 29, when he said to God, "For you are my lamp, O Lord, and my God lightens my darkness." We know the darkness he's talking about, don't we? You hear about it on the news. You see it in our politics. You see the darkness in our racism and in our classism and in our prejudice. You see the darkness in the subtle maneuverings of our culture to categorize things as inappropriate in order to satisfy an agenda rather than a real human need. I mean, look at what's happened to poor Rudolph over the past week. There are other manifestations of darkness that are all around us. It can be unleashed by a pill, or by a drink, or by a click, or by a smoke. It can emerge through a tweet or through a post. And during this season of the year, I know of a lot of people who are overwhelmed by the darkness of grief. In fact, it gets pretty thick these days. As that husband or that wife or a mom or a dad or a son or a daughter or a grandchild is no longer here. And their absence hurts in ways that words can't describe except to say that it feels like darkness. In the words of James Weldon Johnson, oftentimes it's a darkness that is darker than 100 midnights down in the cypress swamp. Some of you know how that feels. But here's what I know. There is no darkness that God's light can't put out. There is no darkness that God's light can't put out. In 2 Samuel 22, David said this in verse 7. He said, "In my distress, I called upon the Lord. To my God, I called, and from his temple, he heard my voice, and my cry came to his ears." And then in verse 10, he says, he bowed the heavens and came down. And I love how he describes his coming down. And thick darkness was under his feet. Do you have the picture of him coming down and just stomping darkness? He reached from on high, he says in verse 17 of chapter 22, and he took me. He drew me out of the mighty waters. He delivered me from my strong enemy. And then in verse 29, he says, "Indeed, you are my lamp, O God. The Lord lightens my darkness." Did you hear that? He can deliver you from your darkness. He wants to be your lamp that lightens whatever darkness you might be experiencing right this very moment. And the light that he offers you and me is Jesus, the light of the world. Now here's a question that I believe we need to wrestle with today. Are you looking for the light of Jesus this Christmas? I mean, that's the question I want to ask. Are you looking for the light of Jesus this Christmas? Or are you surrounding yourself with all sorts of artificial light that in the final analysis provides only temporary relief from the lingering darkness that surrounds you every day? What are you looking for? The light of Jesus? Or some of those twinkling lights that you plug in and unplug? Let me put it this way. I think this reveals a lot about who we are. If you have a question that needs answering, where do you turn first? Google or God's Word? Or if you're struggling with an issue that you need help processing, where do you go first? To a book? Or to the internet? Or to another person? Or do you go to your knees in prayer and ask God for guidance? You see, throughout the Bible, we read about all the different ways that God has delivered people from their distress. We read about how he's comforted people in their grief. We read about how God promises to bring into our lives a peace that surpasses all understanding. We read in the Bible, especially this time of the year, about how he longs and shines his light into the darkness, and that the darkness can never overcome the light. But then something hits us. And sometimes something hits us hard, and oftentimes when something hits us, it's like we suddenly suffer some sort of spiritual amnesia. And we don't turn to him. We don't seek his word. And we don't reach out to him in prayer. Instead, we end up seeking out all the lesser lights of this world, and all the while we wonder why the struggles that so often beset us just keep hanging on. And why is that? Why is it that when we know that God is the light of the world, and he sent his son to be that light for us, and that the darkness would never, why is it that we constantly seek out the lesser lights instead of turning to the one and only light? I think we're reluctant sometimes to pursue the light that is Jesus, because deep down inside we're afraid of what will be exposed when his light shines in certain places of our lives. Jesus said in John 3:19, he said, and this is the judgment, that the light has come into the world, and the people loved darkness rather than light because their deeds were evil. For all who do evil hate the light, and they don't come to the light so that their deeds may not be exposed. Jesus is the light of the world. His light comes into our darkness. But don't you agree that sometimes we don't want anybody to turn on the lights? I mean, there are things that we've done in darkness that we do not want anybody else to see. And so the coming of light means that everything is exposed. The coming of light into our lives means that we've got to all of a sudden deal with the truth. And let's face it, sometimes the truth is pretty painful. There was a priest in a Midwestern city who wanted to help inner city children, and so he came up with a plan. Now, I realize when you hear what he did, you may think, well, that was kind of a strange thing to do. But this is what he did. He wanted these inner city kids to see something more than their own situations. And so he put them on a bus, and he took them around the city to see some things of beauty. And they went to an art museum, and they saw paintings that were painted by the masters. He took them to a symphony matinee so that they could hear beautiful music. He drove them around to a neighborhood that had been completely reworked by a group of architects. And this young priest had in mind, and he did attempt to show these children the best and the brightest things that he knew. Well, after they saw the things that he wanted them to see, they climbed back on the bus, and he took them all back to where they lived. And that night, one of the boys that he had taken around town set his apartment building on fire. They rescued the neighbors and the families that lived there, but the place just burned down. And the priest was in tears when he visited the boy in his detention cell, and he said, "Why did you do this?" And the boy said, "I saw all those beautiful things. And then I came home and I saw how ugly my world was, and I hated the ugliness, so I wanted to burn it down." Sometimes the contrast isn't that stark and dramatic. I mean, sometimes all it takes is looking at Facebook and seeing the perfect lives that are displayed on Facebook, the perfect families, the perfect Christmas celebrations, the perfectly decorated homes that everybody shows on Facebook. I mean, you see beautiful lives that people, have you ever noticed people don't show themselves sick on Facebook? They just show perfection. And you look at that, and then you think about your life. and the struggles that you're facing and the difficulties that you're enduring day by day by day, and you compare what you see there to what's going on in your life, and the only word that can describe it is darkness. I tell you, you shine some light in a dark place and there's no telling what's going to happen. I mean, when all you've seen for a while, or maybe when all you've ever seen is darkness, I mean, that's all you know. And so when all of a sudden light shines, or when for the first time in a long while light comes, you see things that you didn't see before. But here's the thing, darkness continues to remain a choice. In fact, it's possible for light to come into the world and for somebody to say, turn out the lights. Or to put it another way, it's possible for the light of the world to shine on people and those very people choose not to accept it. This is the crisis of the world. The Gospel of John quoted Jesus as saying, John said, light has come into the world and the people love darkness rather than light. And yet the light of the world has come. And the light is Jesus. He is the one who brings grace and truth. I mean, his light shines and reveals the truth of who we are, and his light shines and reveals the truth of who we're not. I'll tell you, when the light that is Jesus shines in our lives, he exposes and he reveals. He is a light of truth. But he's also a light of grace in that while his light exposes all the junk in our lives, forgiveness goes along with it. Tom and his teenage friends were walking around the neighborhood one night. It was a warm night. The moon was not out. It was really dark, and they're walking down the street together, and then all of a sudden one of them saw a police car driving and shouted, "Run!" And they started running. Now, they hadn't done anything wrong, and so they just started running when their friend said run. And so all of a sudden they find themselves running and they couldn't stop. And so they thought, well, we just got to keep running. And so they're running, and a police car turned around the corner after seeing them run and started following them down the road. And so they saw this alleyway, and they turned down an alley, and as they're running, Tom knocked over a trash can and spread garbage all over the place. And suddenly he stopped as the police officers were running and after them. And in fact, one of them got a searchlight, and Tom looks back and he sees this searchlight looking for these boys. And Tom thinks, what am I going to do? And so he looks for a place to hide and couldn't find a place to hide. And then he couldn't find his friends either. And so he saw the garbage kind of piled up over there after he knocked over the garbage can. And so Tom thought, I'll just go hide in the garbage. And so he goes and finds that's where his friends are as well. And so they start putting garbage all over him to try to hide themselves from the police. And all of a sudden, this searchlight is moving across the alleyway and lands on Tom. And then suddenly a voice comes from behind the spotlight. Come out where we can see you. And so Tom stood up. He's totally covered in garbage. And the voice from behind the spotlight says, what are you doing? Tom said, nothing. And the voice said, I can't hear you. What are you doing? And Tom said, officer, I wasn't doing anything wrong. I saw the light and I ran and I knocked over those garbage cans. I'm sorry about the disturbance. And this searchlight is just beaming into his eyes, blinding him in the moment. And he just stood there in the light with nowhere to hide. And then the voice from behind the spotlight said, son, I think I recognize you. Don't you live around the corner? And Tom said, yes. And then all of a sudden his heart just about beats out of his chest because he thinks, oh my gosh, if I don't get arrested, something even worse is going to happen. He's going to tell my parents. But then the voice behind the light said something totally unexpected to Tom. The voice behind the light said, son, I'm not here to punish you. I'm here to protect you. And as he stood before that searchlight, Tom says he caught a glimpse of what it must mean to stand before Jesus, who is the light of the world. I mean, there he was, fully exposed, yet completely protected. He was fully revealed. I mean, everything about him was exposed in the light in that moment, but he was free also from any unnecessary punishment. He stood there, hip deep in garbage, yet he was cleaner than he'd ever felt, somehow cleansed by a light that cast no shadow. Because in that moment, he saw something of what it must mean to stand in the presence of Jesus Christ, who is full of truth and full of grace. Isaiah said, the people who've walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who've dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them light has shone. So let me ask you again, do you see the light? Do you see it? It's a light that offers new beginning, new birth, if you will. For Christ, who is the light, for Christ the Savior is born. And to all who receive him, to all who believe in his name, he gives power to become the children of God, children who are reborn not through human means, but through the bright, shining grace of God. And in that sense, Jesus is the light of the world, light and life to all he brings, as the hymn says. That's the promise for all of us. And my hope is that during this season of Advent, as you and I prepare for our own personal celebrations of the birth of Jesus, my hope is that we'll see his light shining in our lives. A light that reveals all that we might want to try to hide. But in the midst of that revelation, assures us of a forgiveness that we can find nowhere else. And a hope that springs eternal. And a life that is like a light that the darkness can never overcome. And he promises that for you and for me. And I hope we'll receive it. Let's pray.